Charlie, and it really does feel like coming home. And I want to thank you for inviting me here today, and my apologies that I can't stay for the entire time. I've always valued this opportunity to get together with like-minded people so that we could wrestle with the things that matter to us as a collective. But I've committed for a long time now, but ever since the Evergreen line opened in my community, whenever I would come downtown, that I would just use transit. It's easier, it's better for the environment, and I actually can get some work done. So I do need to get back to my community, and it takes a little bit longer, but actually some days when I see the traffic, it's actually not at all a bit longer. But it's also another reason why our government recently announced finally reaching an agreement with the mayors to make sure that we have transit that operates here in the Lower Mainland. So I want to thank you again for having me here, and it is great to see so many faces and to be able to hug so many friends. It feels really, really good to be here. And I too would like to acknowledge and express appreciation for the ability to gather here on the territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nation. And I want to thank all of you for coming here. And I know that it's important to have communities from right across the province, and I understand there's some people who are not from British Columbia here as well. But having the opportunity to come together and talk about our shared values and the importance of making a difference for people in our communities. It's the networking for me that's always been valuable, and it continues to be valuable. I've been an MLA, now this is my second term, but I always felt it was really important to stay connected to community. And I loved being a city councillor. I thought it was a real good way to understand what was happening on the ground, hearing what my neighbors needed, understanding what could make a difference in people's lives. And when I got elected in 2013 as the MLA for Coquitlam-Millarville, Adrian Dix was the leader at the time, and he said, "So Selina, what files do you want? Because everyone in opposition gets a file." And I just said, I want local government. I want municipal affairs. At the time it was community, sport, and cultural development. And he was a little bit surprised because it's not considered one of the sexy files. But for me, it's always been an incredibly important file because of the important work that local governments do. And so given that no one was fighting me for it, I had the pleasure of having that file for 4 years. And over that time, as the opposition spokesperson, on that file, I really got to hear what you were struggling with, what local governments were facing in terms of homelessness, in terms of infrastructure deficits, and really the challenges to meet the needs of your communities. And certainly on the transit file here in the Lower Mainland, it was very heartbreaking, I think, for the mayors having to go through that referendum, which, from my perspective, is an absolute farce. And so it was just, all that energy going into that instead of going into making communities stronger. So when John Horgan called me on July 17th, right, Rob, that's when we got called, the day before, thereabout? Rob Fleming's in the room as well. I just want to acknowledge my colleague, and thanks for being here, Rob. Clap for Rob. When I got the phone call, and the premier designate said, and he always called me Robinson. He said, "So Robinson, what files do you want?" Actually, he said, "What file do you want?" And I said, "Well, I want community, sport, cultural development," because at the time that had been the structure of the ministry. And he said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "Just don't give me energy. I'll take anything else, just not energy." And so what was interesting is he said, "Well, I want you to be my minister for municipal affairs." And we were changing the name, we were taking it back as municipal affairs, recognizing that that's a unique challenge in and of itself, and that you were worthy of a minister that was responsible for municipal affairs. And then he said, "And I want you to take on housing." And I'm like, okay. And then he says, "Oh, it gets better. I want you to take on TransLink too." And while I have these fabulous triplets, it's really important to understand what the Premier was thinking about why he put these together. And I think people in local government appreciate that, because when you think about a housing crisis that we're now facing and the land use planning role of local governments, and when you think about transit, particularly here in the Lower Mainland, and how that plays out in the relationships with local governments, and how it plays out with housing in terms of the opportunity for density, I think it made perfect sense, and it's been my pleasure to be serving as the Minister for Municipal Affairs, Housing, and also the Minister responsible for TransLink for the last 8 months. Now, as a former City Councillor, I do absolutely understand the pressures that many of you face. And I think about some of the public hearings that I was in, where we were looking to do density along a transit corridor, and the neighbors in the area were losing their minds because we were putting in potentially a 21-story building. Even though the neighborhood plan called for much more density and high-rises. But when we brought through the neighborhood plan, which we kept shoving back to the community for more consultation, a 2-year process, we never heard boo. But it wasn't until the rubber hit the road, so to speak, when the actual project came before our council, that all of a sudden something caught someone's attention that there might be a shadow on my yard. Or all that traffic that's going to cause, even though it's a transit corridor where there is more transit and certainly lots of traffic. And even when we demonstrated, or staff demonstrated, that it wasn't going to be as challenging around the traffic, then it was really hard. The decision wasn't hard, but it was hard to sit in the room and have neighbor after neighbor after neighbor talk about how it was bad for the community, when you knew it really wasn't going to be bad. And I remember that. I remember when we were bringing in our first the only homeless shelter in Goodwin, and hearing the neighbors who are physically on the other side of a big train track, right? There's fences on either side, but the neighbors on the other side of the train track, on the other side of 2 fences and the train track, were talking about how their quality of life was going to be affected because we were improving the quality of life for those who were sleeping on the land where the homeless shelter was going to go. I remember sitting in those public hearings and having to face that and make decisions that were best for the community. And before I carry on with my notes, I just noticed that Ron Ray Leonard is here, and I want to thank her for all of her work that she does as MLA now for Courtney Comox. So in the months since being in government, I've had many meetings with local governments to discuss the issues that you're facing. I had 62 meetings at my first UBCM over 4 days, and I learned a lot. And I learned a lot because communities were ready. They were busting at the seams to have a minister who was ready to hear what they had to say. And I was just talking to somebody out in the hallway about, even if I can't deliver, I'm getting comments like, I can't believe you returned my phone call. Or I can't believe you even responded to my email. And I have to say, what the heck were the other ministers doing? If they weren't responding to people like you, people on the front lines, then what the heck were they doing? And even when I can't deliver, because sometimes, the ask is, I don't have an answer, or I don't have the capacity to address that particular issue. Just the gratitude of having someone say, you know what, that is a problem, let me see what I can do, and even if I can't deliver, I know that the people on the front lines, people in local government are very appreciative of having a government that's willing to try and problem solve with them. So the biggest issue that I have to say occurred both at the UBCM as well as in meetings that I have had since then is really about housing affordability. It is by far the absolute biggest issue that I'm hearing from right across the province. And really, and I know that this group probably doesn't need to be reminded, but this is what happens when you have years of inaction and years of neglect on a very important file. We see people who are in our communities under incredible pressure to address housing affordability for their families. And this isn't about a jobs plan, and it isn't about seniors not putting enough money away. And this isn't about people needing to pull up their socks. This is about having runaway housing crisis and having a government that absolutely neglected this file for well over a decade. We know that when people are fortunate enough to find a home that they can afford, particularly in urban centers, it's usually a long way from where they work or where they go to school. And so we've certainly been hearing for years the choices that people have to make, where they're spending hours commuting, and that's precious time away from your families. And these are the heartbreaking stories that I've certainly heard over the years, is when seniors have to decide, because their rents keep going up, where they decide, this one story just stands out for me, where they would decide, this one senior would take their medication every other day so that they could afford the rent. We know that the housing crisis is hurting families and it's hurting seniors. It's hurting young professional families. I am hearing stories every week where young people that we invested in, right, they post-secondary education, we certainly made sure that they had the opportunities, or maybe we didn't, but that's another story. But they're not staying. They're not staying because they can't afford a home. They can't afford to put roots down here. And it's not just in the Lower Mainland. We're hearing stories about what's happening in the interior, what's happening on the island, in rural and northern British Columbia, similar sorts of challenges. And that's not good for any of us. It's not good for us as parents and grandparents, and it's certainly not good for us in terms of growing an economy and making sure that there's opportunities for the next generation. The thing that I appreciated most when I hear from local governments is I declare I'm an urban-suburban minister. And so when I hear from rural British Columbia about what their challenges are, they're a little bit different than the urban centers, a little bit more unique, but they're real just the same. And they're slightly different. So, there was one community I remember hearing who said, our housing crisis isn't a crisis that's broad-based, but we have no place for seniors who have lived out on the ranch or lived out on the farm, and they're aging, and there's no place for them to age. They have to actually go to Kamloops or Kelowna, but that's really not what they want to do. It's also not where their support system is. It's in the small town that they would go into to get their groceries and do their banking and go see their doctor. But the small town doesn't have seniors housing. It doesn't have housing that for rent. It's just not appropriate housing. So we know that it's multifaceted and and it's going to require many different components. And so that's why I'm so proud of the work that we did over the fall. And I think it's important. Certainly my Twitter feed suggested I was doing nothing, but I want to assure you I was doing lots. And we spent the fall meeting with various stakeholders. So certainly UBCM was a really good place for us to start in September and hearing about the range of issues around housing from across the province. But we also had hosted some roundtables, listening to various advocates, renter advocates, landlord advocates. We did hear from the development community, reached out to First Nations, made sure that we were hearing from other groups like the co-op sector and the nonprofit housing sector. And 180 people came from around the province. And we invited those various sectors that all have a component in building housing. We even had the financial sector there because we thought it was really important to understand what they needed. And we brought them all into the same room. And what I learned was that it had never been done before. It had never been done to make sure that we had First Nations and local governments and the private sector and the co-op sector and the nonprofit sector to have all of these various groups all doing housing and making sure that they weren't just all talking to me, but that they were talking to each other around what can we do to address this housing crisis. And I have to tell you, we couldn't get them to shut up, right? We did a World Cafe, which also hadn't been done before, but they had a real opportunity to hear from each other about what they needed in order to make a project work. And the outcome of that was what you see in our 30-point plan. Because we spent the fall, listening to what people were telling us who have lived this for a very long time. And we put together the biggest budget for housing infrastructure in this province ever. That's $7 billion over the next 10 years to invest in. Preserve the homes that we have, because let's be really clear, it's the most affordable housing we have is the homes that we already have. So we set aside $1 billion over the next 10 years to make sure that we can make sure it's energy efficient, make sure that it's seismically safe, and make sure that it's there for the long term. We're also going to be building the homes that people need, and the homes will be a mix of housing, including affordable rental homes for people with low and middle incomes, homes for seniors so they can stay in their communities, new housing for Indigenous people and for women and children fleeing violence. And I have to tell you, it's been well over a decade since there's been any housing designated for women fleeing abuse. And I think that's shameful. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we've included that in our housing plan. We've also included more spaces for student housing. And this is so the old government refused to allow universities to build student housing. They just were not going to allow them to take on the debt. You know, you could argue that it's good debt, because there's always going to be students and they're always going to be paying the mortgage. But they were not allowed to do that. There's actually legislation that doesn't allow them to do that. And it seemed ridiculous. And in my community in Coquitlam, I have a friend of mine lives right along a bus route that goes right up to SFU. And for the first time in the 12 or 14 years that she's lived there, she had two students, one in August and one in September, basically cold call her and ask if she had a room for rent. That's how desperate students were getting. One knocked on the door in August, and a young woman said, "Do you have a room for rent?" And a couple of weeks later, she said after Labor Day, she had a young man who had a van ask if he could rent her alley parking spot, so he could sleep there while he was, while he was going to school, and then he'd come back down to sleep in this van. And she said she was just horrified that it had been so neglected. And so when you think about our affordable housing stock, I remember when I was a student, every basement suite was awesome, right? You got to clean it maybe once every 3 or 4 months. But that was the affordable housing that students used. Well, that doesn't exist for students because we have other people using it. And so, additionally, we know that there are some students using some of that stock. So if we can get students onto campuses and into student-designated housing, it will free up some of that stock that students are currently using. So it's a really important component. And of course, we're also bringing homes, and we've already started, 24/7 for those people who are homeless. We have an enormous target of 114,000 homes, affordable homes, for British Columbians over the next 10 years. And we're not going to be able to do it alone. We've been very, very, very clear that this is going to take partners from all across this province. Nonprofits, co-op sector, local governments, First Nations, landowners, investors, the faith community. We all need to work together to bring this housing to fruition so that people have homes, so that people can put down roots, so that people can contribute to our communities. So in order to do this, we're creating a new housing hub, an arm of BC Housing. And their mandate is to build partnerships, to build homes. And the type of homes that people need and can afford. And the hub's mandate is to be creative and to be aggressive in developing those partnerships, to actually go out and pursue those opportunities. And I have to tell you, the opportunities are enormous. But there's never been a group that has been dedicated to pursue those partnerships. And that's something that we're bringing to government. We need to use or redevelop available land in communities right across this province. And it will take a coordinated effort to address housing affordability. And reaching our goal will require us to work with you at local governments, because we have to sort of laser focus all of our attention on this significant challenge. I also want to thank you for all those years of putting out your requests for affordable housing, because I know that you're on the front line, and I have been around this gathering and other gatherings and hearing from local governments in my years in opposition, and hearing the challenges that you've been saying. And so I invite you to work closely with us so that we can eliminate the barriers to affordable housing. And I also want to let you know that we're prepared to give you the new tools that you need in order to help deliver. So one of the very things that we're looking at right now is giving you the tool of zoning for rental only. It's brand new. I think it'll be first in the nation, and we hope to have that available to you at some point this spring. And we're also going to be providing funding to help local governments collect housing needs data, because data-driven solutions yield better results. And again, I just want to give you an example. When I was in City Council, I'm going to say this was back in 2010 or 11, the developers were coming fast and furious because the Evergreen line was coming to Coquitlam, and so it was opportunity, everything was being driven up, and we were going to be building some density. And I kept saying, and every single project would come forward, and I'd say, so why all the 600 square foot housing? Like, who's living there? I couldn't, you know. And they said, oh, the market, it's the market that's driving that. And it's like, oh, okay. So in Coquitlam, for the most part, we have 600 square foot condos and 3,000 to 8,000, depending on which neighborhood, square foot single family houses. And almost nothing in between. Well, now when we take a look back and we say, well, what market were they selling to? Well, it was an investor and speculator market, right? And so how do we keep track as local government about what our housing needs, what current stock do we have, and what are we going to need projecting into the future? Now, we have regional growth strategies, and that's great, but to actually get down to what kind of housing we need, how much multifamily, how many 2 and 3 bedrooms, how much senior housing are we going to need? It's really helpful to have that data so that you can make informed choices when you have the opportunity to do that, and the provincial government does as well. And I'm confident that together we can create the housing solutions that reflect the diversity of the people of British Columbia. I want to talk for a moment about what's going on around the modular housing, and I want to just tell you a little, the modular housing for homeless people. So when we formed government in July and everyone said, 2 weeks later, why haven't you done anything? I actually had the day, I think we were sworn in on a Wednesday or Thursday, and on Monday I had my very first radio interview. I hadn't even met ministry staff yet, and they wanted to know why I hadn't done anything. But we did hit the ground running, and in September when we did our update, the thing that we knew we needed to do was we needed to address the homeless crisis, and local governments have been on the front lines of that, doing the best they could, and we brought forward a budget update for 2,000 units of modular housing that could be developed pretty quickly. In terms of once there's land was cleared and ready to go, we could, in a matter of months, have housing available for people. And it came with wraparound services, the kinds of services that people need so they can be successful in their housing. And we know that they have much greater challenges than pretty much anybody else in our communities to find housing. But we're also hearing opposition to this housing. And it always breaks my heart when I hear it. And I know that some communities have more challenges than others. But too often, those voices of opposition, are the only ones that get heard. They're the only ones who get to say, not in my backyard. And we know that comes from fear of the unknown. But I really think it's important that we have the other voices elevated as well. That I want this asset in my community. I want this because people are homeless in my community and they need a roof, and they need a toilet, and they need a shower, and they need a place to make a cup of tea. A couple of weeks ago, we heard about people in Vancouver who are homeless, and they chose to stay on the street rather than live in their modular home being offered to them in Markle because of the threats and intimidation of the neighbors. I know that you know that that's not right, and governments doing the essential work of coming up with housing solutions need the voices of support in our communities. I know that you need to hear from people who are glad to see action, people who say yes in my backyard. If it means a roof for someone who has been sleeping without a roof or a warm, safe home, for someone who has lived alone and cold in the bush for far too long. You have an important role to play. And I want to do whatever I can to help you do the things that you need to do when those voices come to the forefront. So I know that you need support of your citizens to let them know that we are all together on the right track. So recently I heard a young woman in Vancouver named Alexandra O'Donoghue. She's the mother of 3 studying to get her bachelor's degree in social work. And she sits on the Mayor of Vancouver's task force for mental health and addiction. But not too long ago, Alexandra was a mother without a roof over her head, bouncing from shelter to shelter while trying to beat addiction. Well, today she's sober and an advocate for temporary modular housing because it was social housing, it was treatment, and it was community support that helped her get back on her feet. We need to hear more success stories like these. And I know that it takes time and considerable effort to work with the fear and anger that can be associated with homelessness. But I'm confident in your ability and in your commitment to helping elevate the voices of support and making sure that those voices are heard around council tables and that they're heard in media so that our communities don't feel, that these people who are homeless don't feel like they don't have a voice. Because until they're on their feet, we are their voice. We have seen numerous examples of supported housing that integrate seamlessly into a community. And I just want to give a shout out, of all places, to Abbotsford. Now, Hearthstone Place not only integrated into the area, but the neighborhood saw a decrease in calls to first responders since the building's opening. And many residents who had been vocal and active opponents to the program have changed their positions since its opening and have welcomed the residents who provided the leadership to move forward with housing for people experiencing homelessness, despite the pushback. That is what local leadership on social inclusion looks like. And I know that your leadership and your local governments play a key role in the success of these efforts that we're continuing to bring forward. As I said, I know that you're on the front lines and have local influence over the types of housing that we build. I know that together we can play a pivotal role in elevating the position of those without voices and start to see real change in our communities. I want to thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's always a pleasure. It feels like coming home. So thank you for being my home. And I wish you all the best for all the learning that you're going to be doing over the next couple of days. Thanks.